Hi everybody, I'm Bo Van Riper, research librarian here at the Martha's Vineyard Museum, and this is another installment in our occasional series of treasures from the museum library and archives. One of the questions that I often get from visitors is, what's the oldest book you have here? And I'm going to draw on the depths of my professional expertise here and give you an honest answer. I'm not entirely sure, but I am sure that this book in my hands is, if not the oldest, then certainly one of the oldest. It's a copy of Experience Mayhew's 1727 book, Indian Converts, which was, to be honest, his attempt at fundraising for his project, his family's ongoing multi-generational project of spreading Christianity among the Wampanoag. This is basically a compilation of success stories of Wampanoag who, as Experience Mayhew tells it, have learned the gospel, embraced Christianity, and died professing their faith in the Christian God. Mayhew and other missionaries were big on dying speeches of people because it was believed that in their last words, people uttered the sentiment that was most true to their heart and that they most deeply believed in. So Experience felt if they died praising God and Jesus, that meant he'd gotten through to them and won another convert for his brand of religion. As always, the Wampanoag themselves might have seen things differently, and we should consider at least the possibility that Mayhew, in his zeal for fundraising, improved some of those dying speeches, or possibly even made them up altogether. It's worth noting that although this is a beautiful leather-bound edition with gold stamping on the spine and whatnot, fundraising being what it was, Mayhew and his successors in the missionary business also brought out cheap paperback editions with printed cardboard covers that slipped easily into a jacket pocket, so that if you wanted to read the dying speeches of pious Indian women or pious Indian chiefs of Martha's Vineyard, subsections of Mayhew's book, the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel was there to make that possible for you. Even in the 1720s, even in the 1830s when these were published, good press agentry was important for nonprofit organizations, and we have the evidence of it here in the library. Nobody asks, why do you have Experience Mayhew's Indian Converts in the library? The Vineyard connection is obvious. Lots of people ask, however, why do we have Taps for Private Tussie, a comic novel from 1943, well reviewed in its day, but completely forgotten now, about a young man from Appalachia who joins the army? The answer is not that the text or the author has anything to do with Martha's Vineyard, but that the illustrator has something to do with Martha's Vineyard. The numerous drawings that illustrated this edition of Taps for Private Tussie were drawn by Chilmark Summer resident Thomas Hart Benton, who's better known as one of the leading figures in American regionalist painting. That Taps for Private Tussie was done in 1943, and that Benton was doing illustrations for a piece of popular fiction after he'd been featured on the cover of Time magazine, after he'd done WPA murals, after he'd been hailed as one of the leading American artists of the new century, I think tells you something interesting about Benton and about the omnivorous nature of his creativity. His interest in taking on a project like this suggests that he was not just an academic painter, but somebody who gloried in art in all its forms. It may also suggest that right at the moment the opportunity was presented to him, he needed the extra paycheck. But in any event, part of our Thomas Hart Benton holdings are this copy of a now forgotten book, memorable for the fact that its illustrations capture immediately and without a doubt that classic Benton spirit of motion and simplicity matched with depth. Now, viewers of a certain age might remember these two gentlemen in the picture as Moby Dick and the Duke, two tramps they would have been called in the 1950s, who in the cartoons that Dennis Wortman drew for one of the big New York newspapers commented on the social and political foibles of the post-World War II era. Moby Dick and the Duke also showed up on the Wortman's Christmas cards, and this is the 1963 one, featuring the two characters wishing the recipient a Merry Christmas, and inscribed on the back, "And a very happy New Year with much love from Hilda." Hilda was Dennis Wortman's wife, the mother of the Dennis Wortman who now flies drones and gives tours and does other things for the Martha's Vineyard Museum. And the recipient of this particular card was Helen Howland Hart, a daughter of an old Vineyard Haven family who was a dear friend of the Wortmans, and who, when she died, passed this card on to her caregiver, who in turn passed it on in this past weekend to us. So an early Merry Christmas from Moby Dick, the Duke, and the spirit of Dennis Wortman, cartoonist and summer resident. Stanley Murphy, who was born in New York and moved to Martha's Vineyard after World War II, where he practiced his trade as a painter, is perhaps best known today for having painted the 4 murals on the walls of the Catherine Cornell Theater in the upstairs of the Tisbury Town Hall. There were 4 murals, one depicting a typical Vineyard whaling ship crew, one depicting Menemsha in the winter with fishermen bringing their lobster pots ashore, one depicting the legend of Moshep grabbing a sperm whale by the tail in order to feed his people on the cliffs at Aquina, and this one, which for all the times I looked at it sitting in the Catherine Cornell Theater, just struck me as a generic scene of somebody running through the dunes somewhere around State Beach, enjoying a beautiful summer day on the Vineyard as the brightly colored sails of sunfish sailboats dot the waters. And then we recently received a set of postcards depicting these 4 murals, and in the process of cataloging them, I looked more closely at the summer postcard and at the description printed on the back, as descriptions are in postcards. And the description said, "Vineyard summer then and now." And I realized that the schooner depicted in the background is meant not to be necessarily the Shenandoah taking people out for a day sail or children for a week-long adventure during a school vacation. It's meant to be one of the tens of thousands of ships that, before the opening of the Cape Cod Canal, passed up and down Vineyard Sound and called at Edgartown and Vineyard Haven and helped to fuel their economies. And that if you look even further in the background, the ferry pulling into Oak Bluffs, or perhaps Cottage City as it's meant to be then, is not a modern steel-hulled ship with its belly stuffed with cars, but an old steam-powered side-wheeler, like the ones that brought the First Methodist to camp meeting and that brought the people with their steamer trunks and their silk hats and their wool bathing suits, yikes, to the beaches of a Victorian-era resort that began in the 1880s the process of turning Martha's Vineyard into a tourist destination. There's always something new to see in these objects if you just take a second look. This is the kind of thing that people think of when they think of archives, a document on old rag paper written with a quill pen or a fountain pen, folded and refolded until it tears along the places where it's been folded. A relic of a time 2 centuries ago. But the most interesting thing about this isn't the physical form, but the information it contains. It's a testimonial from the pastor of the Chilmark Church of Christ, what we'd think of today as the Congregational Church, saying that Didamia Tilton, the wife of Joseph Tilton, was a member in good standing of the congregation. This came not from the Vineyard, but from a cache of letters from various members of the Tilton family from a town in southeastern Ohio, because Didamia and Joseph and several of their sons, along like many other vineyarders, pulled up stakes in the early 1800s and moved to the Ohio country, which had just recently been organized into a state. The vineyard by that time, the 1810s, had been divided and subdivided through multiple generations, and if you weren't the firstborn or second-born son of a prosperous family, your chance of finding enough land to run a farm that would support you and your family on were getting slimmer and slimmer. So vineyarders left for Maine, for Connecticut, and by the 1810s for Ohio. And this slip of paper, folded up and tucked into some pocket or purse or box of treasures, went with Didamia to ensure that when she reached what was then the frontier after a long overland journey, that at least some piece of the life she'd left behind could be picked up again seamlessly there, that she'd be welcomed into the local church as a God-fearing Christian woman who came with the endorsement of her pastor back home on the island that she'd likely never see again. In the grand sweep of American history, this is the smallest and most unremarkable of documents. But to Didamia Tilton, it must have meant everything in the world, which is why, one suspects, it was kept and treasured and passed on to children and grandchildren and eventually made its way back to the island where it began. Edward Willis of Kingstown, Rhode Island, got straight to the point. E. Norton, Esquire, he wrote in May of 1880, please keep me well reposted in regard to wool. What would you ask for 5,000 to 10,000 pounds delivered on board the boat? Mr. Wills, we can assume, was a manufacturer of wool cloth. Eliakim Norton was a farmer on the vineyard, and like most vineyard farmers of his era, sheep were a critical part of his operation. Sheep were also evidently a big part of his operation, given that requests for 5,000 to 10,000 pounds of wool was something that was not remarkable in his relationship with Mr. Willis. It's impossible to overstate the extent to which sheep dominated the agricultural and economic world of the vineyard, from the Revolutionary War, when Major General Gray and his redcoats made off with 10,000 of the beasts to feed British troops on the mainland, on down through the end of the 19th century. Sheep were the predominant livestock on the vineyard, and the vast, rolling, completely treeless landscapes edged with stone walls that show up in the paintings of Amelia Watson from the 1870s and 80s and from countless early photographs of the vineyard are the results of land being cleared for sheep, stone walls being raised to pen in sheep, and any attempt of the land to reforest being cut off literally and figuratively by sheep cropping grass, shoots, and everything else down to the level of the dirt itself. Eventually, the raising of sheep on the vineyard faded, dairy cattle and other things took over, and the trees and the grass and the bushes regrew, creating the island we know today. But for Eliakim Norton and Edward Willis of Kingstown, sheep was big business, and the business of the vineyard was sheep, as these letters and others that passed between the two of them, recently added to our collection, make clear. Letter that begins, "My dear friend, your letter and the very nice pictures arrived on September 8th, and I was glad to get them. A picture sent in return, a late 19th century woman in a full skirt seated in a chair in a photographer's studio." They're the kind of thing that 1,000 examples of lie in various folders in the archives. And yet, as you read on and as you look at the background of the photograph, you realize that there's something more going on here. The woman in the photograph is polychristian. Polychristian, Christian as in Fletcher Christian, as in "this is mutiny, Mr. Christian," as in the master's mate of HMS Bounty who took the ship from Captain Bligh and returned with the other mutineers to Tahiti, where they took on board the native women they'd taken as common law wives and sailed away first to Pitcairn Island and then to Norfolk Island, where the survivors among them, John Adams and a few others, made a life for themselves, settled down, raised families, and where a Martha's Vineyard whaleman named Leroy Lewis was put off in the middle of the Pacific, suffering from a terrible and debilitating disease, and left among the Norfolk Islanders by his captain so that he could be nursed back to health and hopefully flag down another ship to take him home once he was well. Leroy Lewis did survive, and he came home to the vineyard, and he retired eventually to Oak Bluffs after a life on the world's oceans. And he wrote to the people who'd kept him safe and nursed him back to health and who'd become his friends on Norfolk Island. And in the way that things happen sometimes, the letter went amiss in the post and was delayed not just for months but for years. It arrived on Norfolk Island long after he sent it, when most of the people he'd known were dead. But the people of Norfolk Island who'd been children when he had arrived there and who still remembered him as the stranger from America wrote back to him, polychristian among them, and updated him on what had happened on the island since he'd left. Polychristian writes proudly of the fact that she was a married lady now with 15 children, all of whom had lived. The fact that all of whom had lived would be a remarkable achievement tells you perhaps all you need to know about being a parent in the 19th century. The correspondence continued for a few more rounds, closing off a circle that had been begun when a longboat from Lewis's ship put him ashore at Norfolk Island. And Lewis filed away the letters and the pictures in a box which, in the fullness of time, came to us, giving the vineyard a small but unique tie, not just to an episode in the history of the whaling industry, but to the most famous mutiny in naval history. As we begin the 75th running of the Martha's Vineyard Bass and Bluefish Derby, it seems like a good moment to remember that thanks to the generosity of the Derby Committee some years back, we have a collection of more than 1,000 photographs of Derby participants over the years, of t-shirts, of medals, of buttons, of photographs of people fishing from shore and from boats. And we also have this, a plaque made to commemorate one of the legends of Derby history, Serge de Somov, alias the Count, alias the Mad Russian, who was to the Derby in the 1960s what Bill Russell was to basketball or Mickey Mantle was to baseball, an unstoppable force who won the prize for heaviest shore bass 4 years in 64, 65, 66, and again in 1969. De Somov was an East European immigrant with, it was said, an aristocratic background. He was mysterious, he spoke in a foreign accent, and he did his fishing on the Vineyard scene at a time when the Cold War was still very much a thing, and Khrushchev and the Cuban Missile Crisis were still fresh in everybody's mind. But he was, both as a person and as a fisherman, regarded with nothing but warmth and respect by his fellow competitors as anybody who could catch the heaviest shore bass 3 years running had to be. Serge de Somov, Derby legend, immigrant, and one more part of the complex history of Martha's Vineyard.